Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 6 of I Saw a Bird, Audubon Spring Migration Show. I'm David Ringer, and I saw a bird this weekend that I wanted to share with you. It was a black-throated blue warbler, which is one of my favorite warblers. Beautiful male, foraging low in a tree in the park near my house here in New York City. Just really beautiful bird. How about you, Christine?
Hello, everybody. I am Christine Lynn, and recently I saw a bird that many of you are probably familiar with. It was a mallard, and it was extra special because I saw a whole family of mallards, and I saw this row of just ducklings on a log, which is very fitting because later today we are going to talk about baby birds. And that's a great photo, David.
Thank you. And nothing cuter than some baby ducks. So we're really glad everyone's joined us tonight. We have a very special show lined up for you. We're starting off with an amazing interview from legendary conservationist Dr. Jane Goodall. We're also going to hear from some Audubon outreach biologists about amazing migration facts. It'll be Mikko Jimenez and Witco. And then we're going to virtually head to Florida to visit the Audubon Center for Birds of Prey, where we're going to spend time with some real baby owls and talk about what you should do if you find a baby bird. So we're in our 6th week of I Saw a Bird, which is kind of hard to believe. And we wanted to highlight some of the many tweets that we're seeing you share when you want to share your sightings and bird observations. So we're just going to scroll through the hashtag. Remember that you can use the hashtag I Saw a Bird on your favorite social media platform. And these are some of the beautiful images and posts that we're seeing on that hashtag on Twitter. A beautiful indigo bunting there. Really nice. Well, keep those observations coming.
Yeah, there's been so many species, and it's been super fun just watching everyone send in their observations and birds that they've been seeing from all across the flyway. So like David said, keep them coming. Now, it is truly an honor to be able to introduce our first segment, and we were incredibly excited when we learned that animal behavior expert, conservationist, and activist Dr. Jane Goodall was interested in joining us for an episode of I Saw a Bird. And 7 p.m. Eastern time is actually 12 a.m. London time, so Dr. Goodall very graciously agreed to sit down with Audubon's own Preeti Desai for a pre-recorded interview. And Dr. Goodall is, of course, the founder of the Jane Goodall Institute, as well as a UN Messenger of Peace. So without further ado, let's check out the interview.
Hi, Dr. Goodall. It's an absolute honor to talk with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us on behalf of National Audubon Society members, our staff and volunteers, and the folks tuning in to watch I Saw a Bird Audubon Spring Migration Show. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Preeti Desai, and I'm the social media director here at Audubon. I'm a nature and wildlife lover, and of course, an absolute bird nerd. And I'm a huge fan of yours. I know a lot of people probably came across your name and your work when they were younger, but I don't think I'd heard of you until I was a little bit older, maybe in college or just after. The first book I read of yours was Reason for Hope, and its message really inspired me, and I'm sure many others like me, to want to go into the conservation field. So the first question I want to ask you is, how are we all connected to each other, to birds, to chimpanzees, to other wildlife?
Well, you could answer that in different ways. I mean, we can go back and back into the mists of the past and think that there was one little cell and it began to grow and it began to change and it began to give rise to different organisms. And one of those ended up millions of years later being us, you and me.
Yeah, and I mean, I think tying to that, for a long time, it was fashionable to say that we need to leave nature and the wild alone for it to recover. But today, people are finally recognizing the importance and value of involving people and local communities, you know, from the beginning when it comes to preserving and protecting nature. You've been working with local people around the world, but, you know, especially when I think of Lake Tanganyika, for years to improve economic outlooks and to preserve habitat for wildlife. Can you talk about the importance of that work?
Well, it all began back in 1986. 1986, I helped put together a conference in Chicago. And for the first time, we brought together I think it was about 7 different field stations studying chimps. And when I began, it was just me. So I went to the conference as a scientist and I left as an activist. And I didn't really know quite what to do, but we got together a bit of money and went to I think it was 7 different range countries of chimps in Africa to learn more firsthand about what was happening, because I don't think you can speak really about something in a meaningful way if you don't have some firsthand experience. I also learned at the same time about the plight that was affecting so many people in and around chimp habitat, the crippling poverty, the lack of good health and education. And it came to a head when I flew in a small plane over the Gombe area. 1990, when I flew over, it was a tiny island of forest, surrounded by completely bare hills, more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere, struggling to survive. So that's when it hit me. If we don't do something to help these people find ways of living without destroying the environment, we can't even try to save the chimps. But you know, for all of these different things, we've got to first alleviate poverty. Because when you're really poor, you're going to buy the cheapest. You can't afford to worry about how it was made and did it harm the environment or animals. Or you're going to cut down the last trees and fish the last fish in your desperation to feed your family. So we began the Jane Goodall Institute's program, Take Care, or Tukari as we call it, which is our method of community-based conservation. Started with a group of local Tanzanians going into the 12 villages around Gombe and asking them how they felt we could help them. And from that, it's developed into a really holistic program. And it's now in 104 villages throughout virtually all of the remaining chimp habitat in Tanzania. And it's spread into 6 other African countries. And so it's working with the local people who now understand that protecting the environment isn't just about saving wildlife, it's their own future.
One thing we can all agree on is that young people are the key to preserving and protecting our planet into the future. Here at Audubon, we recently started the Audubon Campus Chapter program to engage younger folks in our mission. You started the Roots and Shoots program after meeting with a group of high school students, I think in 1991, and that's since grown into a global movement. What role do you think young activists play in this climate, and how do you best equip them with the right tools to drive change?
Well, our Roots and Shoots program is slightly different from, I think, all other youth programs, and that it's entirely bottom-up and it's youth-driven. So these 12 high school students, you mentioned them, that started it. I'd been around the different schools. It was Gombe's 30th anniversary. We had a meeting of about 30, and from that meeting, Roots and Shoots was born with the main message, every individual makes a difference every day. We all have a role to play. You know, let's break down the barriers between people of different nations and culture and religion, and realize that more important than your language and the color of your skin and your culture is the fact that we're all human beings. And so this Roots and Shoots program is now in 65 countries, growing quite fast. And it's kind of strange in this pandemic because, you know, I should be now going and visiting the kids in some places, and of course I can't, but I can reach out like this.
One thing I wanted to ask, and I think this is something that we get asked a lot, and you probably do too, but to build off of what you were just talking about, what advice would you give to young individuals who are interested in a career in conservation?
Well, you know, I was 10 years old when I decided, having read Dr. Dolittle and Tarzan, that I was going to go to Africa when I grew up, live with wild animals, and write books about them. And everybody laughed at me. How would I get to Africa? It was very far away. We didn't have money, very little money. War was raging. World War II was raging at that time. And I was just a girl. Girls didn't do that sort of thing. But my mother, she said, if you really want to do something like this, you're going to have to work awfully hard and take advantage of every opportunity. If you don't give up, maybe you'll find a way to do that or something like it. And I think the big message here, which has been and reinforced by what we've learned from the chimps over 60 years, is that the thing for parents is not to desperately push their child in a direction the child doesn't want to go, but to support what the child wants to do. And very often the child will change.
We sort of talked about this when we first met today, but given all of your travels and all the people you've met, I was wondering if you have any objects that you carry with you to remind yourself of the resilience and hope that people embody.
No, you know I have, don't you? I mean, you know, I've got Piglet, and I've got Ratty, and I've got Cow, and I've got Octavia, the octopus. They've all got stories. And then above all, I've got Oopsie. He's always hiding, Mr. H. Mr. H has been with me in 66 countries now, and he's 28 years old, so.
Yes, I was hoping to meet Mr. H.
Mr. H. Unfortunately, you can't touch him, but if you do, the inspiration rubs off. So.
This is a simple question, but one I'm sure many of our viewers are wondering. What's your favorite bird, Dr. Goodall?
My favorite bird? Well, I think it just has to be a robin, because, you know, when I was little, I had robin who came and nested in my bookcase.
So when I was fairly new to Audubon and fairly new to the world of birds, I was given an opportunity to visit Nebraska to see the sandhill cranes during their migratory stopover in the spring on their way to the nesting grounds in the north. That trip was probably one of the most incredible experiences of my life. While I was there, I learned that you've been going back to see the crane migration for almost 2 decades. What keeps you going back year after year?
Because for several reasons. One, just the feeling of the birds coming in wave after wave after wave after wave against the sunset sky. And it's incredible. But secondly, you know, we've harmed the environment. The birds are having to live off the leftover corn after the corn is harvested. The fields where they used to get food, the wild grasses have gone. And yet, with all the harm that we've done, they still come, hundreds and thousands of them. Cranes and the snow geese, the various kind of ducks. And it's just the resilience of nature.
What's one message you'd want to give to our viewers today?
I think, honestly, the most important message for any children who are listening is the message my mother gave me. If there's something you really want to do, work hard, take advantage of opportunity, and don't give up. And that you as an individual make a difference every day. I think those, you know, basically that Roots and Shoots main message, you make a difference every day. You get to choose what sort of difference that you make. And even those living in poverty, they can choose whether to be kind to an animal. They can choose how they interact with each other. So I think, you know, just remember that whatever you do, you're making a difference to something or someone every single day. That's, I would say that's key.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goodall, for joining us today. This has been, you know, an honor, and I know that our viewers will really enjoy the messages that you've shared with us today.
Thanks. It's been good talking to you.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.
Wow, what a hero. I also think there's something really wonderful about the fact that Dr. Goodall's favorite bird is the robin. That's, of course, the European robin, which we'll show a picture of here. It looks different from the North American robin, but you can see the resemblance that gives them the same name. And we so often hear from our family and friends and from viewers of I Saw a Bird that their favorite birds are the birds they see around them every day. Because that familiarity of the birds around their homes, with their families, means so much in their daily lives.
Yeah, I love that photo too. It's such a boar, but it's such a cute, round little robin. And like many other people, I also love and appreciate our fellow robins around the world. And I also thought it was really powerful that Dr. Goodall say that poverty is an environmental issue at its core. And she was also an early advocate for community-based conservation from the beginning. And I think that's really important to emphasize because you can't really separate the human impact from environmental work if you want to really create this kind of change together. And I also, it's such an honor to be able to witness this interview with Jane Goodall, because I remember when I was in 3rd grade, one of my first projects that I remember is that we had to choose a hero to write about. And the person I chose was Dr. Goodall. And she became my first conservation hero. And I'm sure I can speak for myself and many others that she is truly an inspiration. So Dr. Goodall, thank you for your impact and for inspiring young environmentalists all around the world.
Yes, that's really, really interesting, Christine. She's really had an enormous impact, and it's such a pleasure to have had her on I Saw a Bird. So for all of you watching, we actually will be posting the full extended interview with Dr. Goodall on our website. It's about a 40-minute interview between Preeti and Dr. Goodall. So please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to drop the link in the comments right now so you can go directly there. So subscribe to the YouTube channel and you'll get notified when the video is posted. So we're excited to share that full interview with all of you. Well, for our next segment, people back in our own time zone, we're going to be welcoming outreach biologists from Audubon's Migratory Bird Initiative, Mikko Jimenez and Chad Witko. Mikko's research interests lie in the effects of human land use on bird populations, and Chad's interests are in the distribution of birds and the patterns of vagrancy. Think about the rare bird alerts that are going off this time of year. I don't think they would mind my saying that they're both uber bird nerds, and they're going to be here with us for a few minutes to answer all of your bird migration questions. So Mikko, Chad, welcome.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks,
Hello.
David. Thanks so much for having us.
So yeah, thanks for joining. So since this is a migration show, I have to ask, what is your favorite migration story? And we can start with Chad and we'll go to Mikko.
Sure, and there's so many to choose from, but I have to go with the bar-tailed godwit and their amazing journey from Alaska to New Zealand. You know, this is something that researchers have, kind of known was an incredible feat, but it wasn't until 10 years or so ago that researchers putting satellite tags on these birds were able to really understand how amazing this journey is. So these birds leaving from Alaska will fly down to New Zealand over the heart of the Pacific Ocean, about 7,000 miles nonstop, without food, without water, without rest. And this takes about 8 days for them to complete this journey all the way down to New Zealand. And this is nonstop. So these birds are migrating further in one length of time than just about any other bird that we are aware of. And it's just hard not to pick this. And the incredible thing is that once these birds get to New Zealand, this is only the halfway point for them. And so when they fly back to Alaska, they're making a similar length journey, flying nonstop to the Yellow Sea, the shores of China and Korea, where they refuel in these critical wetlands that are there before making their journey back to Alaska to breed.
That's an incredible story. So Mikko, what about you? What's your favorite migration story?
Yeah, a lot of good different stories. Bar-tailed godwit's a great one, Chad. One that comes up for me is the Northern Meteor, I think is a really good story. These are birds that winter in sub-Saharan Africa. And some of them migrate east over Eurasia to their breeding grounds in Alaska. And others go west over the Atlantic Ocean to breed in Greenland and certain places in Canada. And it's one of those migration stories, you just kind of look at the routes that they take and how far they're moving. And I think it just really highlights, these birds are going 9,000 miles each way. It just really emphasizes that conserving birds like that and species like that, it just has to be an international effort. Birds kind of fly unaware of our national borders. So just when you look at a bird migration story like that, it's just really clear that a successful effort would have to be global.
Just amazing. And for our viewers who may not be familiar with Northern Meteors, they're about the size of a bluebird. So a bird that small doing a migration like this is amazing. And you can see a link to learn more in the comments section. So keep your questions coming in for Chad and Nico. One of our viewers, Jennifer, wants to know, Are rare or incidental sightings of birds an indication of expanding ranges, or are there other explanations? Chad, I think that's a good one for you.
Sure. I think the answer is it really depends. And for some birders, you know, where you're at and the birds you're seeing is a good answer to start with. So here in the Northeast, you know, I'm in Vermont. I'm also from upstate New York. You know, 10, 15 years ago, black vultures, you know, they were really hard to come by. They were really hard to see. This is a bird that's found really in the southeastern portions of our country. And since the late 70s, these birds have been, you know, expanding their ranges north. And it's something that now, in the last 10, 15 years, you know, we're able to find these birds with growing regularity. And it's something that in some places, you know, we can see daily, if not annually. And the amazing thing about this is that birders going out every day submitting their sightings to things like eBird are helping to document range expansions like this in real time.
I've seen that in places where I have family as well, Chad. So that's about range expansion, but sometimes birds just truly don't belong somewhere, right? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and these are the birds that birders get really excited about on things like rare bird alerts and local listservs. And you know I've been guilty of chasing some rare birds myself. We like to think of these birds as vagrants. You know, these are birds that are, you know, occurring in a place that they normally don't occur. And places in the United States, you know, we see vagrants as far off, you know, as places as Asia or Europe, but quite often they're just birds from other parts of our own country. And there's a lot of mechanisms at play that cause vagrancy. But the important thing to remember is that birds aren't really truly lost the way we think. You know, birds have these internal compasses and clocks that tell them the direction that they want to go and for how long they want to fly to get there. And so they know where they're going, but they just might be wired differently. And so birds will show up in random places that birders don't expect and create quite a flurry. You know, one of my favorite vagrant stories over the past few years was the vermilion flycatcher that showed up in Maine. You know, this was Maine's first vermilion flycatcher that was documented. This is a bird of the Southwest. And, you know, what was so incredible about it is that this bird was actually discovered on Hog Island on the live osprey nest cam. And if it wasn't for that camera being in the right place at the right time, we may never have noticed that this bird was around. And that's the beauty of these birds, you know, is that we get to enjoy them sometimes well out of range and see something that's really surprising.
Cool.
Really beautiful.
Yeah. And a lot of people are saying it's a beautiful bird. It definitely is. So we have another question from someone named Michael, who asks, as birds are coming through in the spring, they look different than they do when they return in the fall. Can you talk about those plumage changes? And I think, Chad, that would be a good question for you to take as well.
Sure. You know, as birders, we look at plumages and as one of the key features in identifying birds. And sometimes it can be really tricky when birds look different at different times. Well, birds change their feathers out every year, sometimes twice a year, sometimes more depending on the species and what their molt strategies are. But the process of molt, the systematic replacement of feathers, you know, that happens because birds use their feathers for so many parts of their life. You know, they use them to fly, to thermoregulate, to announce their mates. And these are like clothing. And, you know, if we wore our clothing outside every day in the elements and the sun, the rain, you know, they would be tattered and beat up by the end of the year. So birds need to replace these feathers to live. And the great thing is that birds have different outfits. And so they don't always wear the same outfit in the fall as they do in the spring. And great examples of this are things like bobolinks and scarlet tanagers, you know, where the males look more like females in the fall than they do in the spring in their vibrant plumages. Another great example I can think of is the Blackpool Warbler. You know, this is a migrant that many of us are starting to experience on the East Coast coming through. And in the springtime, you know, this warbler is strikingly plumaged. It's got a bright black cap and a white cheek patch, these bold patterns. But come the fall, these birds change into something more drab. They're yellow-green and they have blurry streaks on the side. They look nothing like they would during the springtime. And it can be hard to tell these birds apart sometimes from other warblers in the fall. We have this phrase, confusing fall warblers, and there's a reason for that. They're difficult for a lot of birders. But one of the great things is that even though these birds are changing their plumages, so much doesn't change, their overall shape and structure. And one of the cool things about Blackpool warblers is that they have these really long wings that birders sometimes can notice in flight or when the bird is perched. And those wings are really a cool thing because they're indicative of the fact that Blackpool warblers are also long distance migrants. You know, these birds, much like the bar-tailed godwit, are exhibiting some of the most incredible migrations that we can think of here in North America.
Really, really cool, and beautiful shots too. So Mikko, a question for you. There's a relatively new form of technology called geolocators. And I believe you once described those as tiny high-tech backpacks. So these geolocators have helped us learn about the Blackpool warbler's migration. Tell us a little bit about the science behind that and also how this kind of information helps inform conservation.
Sure, yeah. So I love that descriptor because it's surprisingly apt. They are kind of little backpacks that researchers can put on birds that they'll carry around throughout the year. And so what geolocators are, they're essentially light sensors. And what they're doing is they're taking down light data as the bird moves throughout the year. And as far as what we can do with that with researchers is, I really like how our migration ecologist, Bill DeLuca, described this. He said it's really similar to how early explorers would track their movements at sea. Basically, when we get the birds back and we take the backpack off, we can look at the data that it has. And if you know the date and kind of the length of the day, and some estimation for solar noon, you can kind of get, you can estimate a latitude and a longitude for each day that the bird had the backpack on. And so what you're looking at here is we run those light data through a computer program, and we can kind of roughly track out, where the bird took the backpack for the entire, annual cycle. And this is really important for us because it really helps us understand where birds are going and, more importantly, how they're getting there, how they're getting from point A to point B.
Cool, thanks for sharing that. That's a really cool little visual. So Mikko, here's another one for you. Several of our viewers are hoping that you can talk about the unique challenges that urban landscapes create for migratory birds.
Sure, yeah, it's a great question because cities line our major flyways here in North America along both coasts and the Mississippi Flyway. And that presents a number of challenges for birds. The most obvious thing is that urban development tends to reduce the amount of habitat that birds can use either for breeding or for stopover. And what I mean by stopover is just places where birds can kind of pull over on their journey and refuel and rest and get ready for the next leg. So that's problematic for birds. But something that I think we think about less is that cities put out a lot of artificial light. And that's really problematic for birds because most of them are migrating at night and they use kind of celestial cues to orient themselves and navigate. So it can be really disorienting for a bird to move through a city where there's a lot of artificial light. And then one thing that's really direct is that the buildings that we build in urban centers with glass windows and things like that can basically be invisible to the birds as they're flying through at night. And they can fly into these windows, and that can be a huge problem. Window strikes is what we call them. Window strikes are a huge source of mortality as birds migrate through urban centers.
Yeah, that's really important. So what are some things that our viewers, if they live in urban environments, what are some things that they can do to help?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think so often urbanites tend to think of conservation issues as kind of this far distant issue. But what I think is cool about bird migration is it's a really important opportunity for city dwellers to directly impact bird conservation and protect these species. The silver lining to all of the challenges that I just talked about is that those are all things that we can control to some extent. We can provide habitat with native gardens for birds to stop over in or to breed in. We can reduce the amount of artificial light that we put out. There's been a lot of work done, particularly by the folks at Birdcast, to understand when birds are moving over urban centers, and particularly when migration is peaking. And if city dwellers are aware of that and can kind of reduce the amount of artificial light that they're putting out, it can have a huge effect on conservation. And then more broadly, I would just say, being aware of the conservation efforts kind of locally can be a big deal. Right now, last year, one thing that happened with NYC Audubon is that they organized a huge effort to pass legislation requiring bird-friendly glass in new buildings. And that's something that affects me here in Brooklyn. Another really good example that's close to home is in Chicago last year, there was a nesting pair of piping plovers for the first time in decades. And, Chicagoans kind of stepped up to volunteer their time to physically monitor and protect those species. And they fledged, new piping plover chicks for the first time in decades. So, so often urbanites kind of get counted out in conservation issues. But I think in doing that, we discount how civic pride can be converted into conservation action. And I think that, bird migration has been an area where that has been really clear how effective that can be.
It's really well said, and it makes me think of Dr. Goodall's reminder that everyone can make a difference every day. So true. So Joanne, who's watching tonight, wants to know whether birds eat during their migratory journeys. Chad, why don't you talk about some of the food sources birds use along the way?
Yeah, and this is a really great question that many of us at Audubon actually hear quite a bit. Do birds eat on their journeys, and if so, what are they eating? And it really depends on the species. I mentioned the bar-tailed godwit early on, and they make this incredible journey nonstop from Alaska to New Zealand. Before they make that journey, they fatten up on the coastal wetlands and mudflats of Alaska, and even reduce some of their organs in size to pack on more fat because they can't stop. Well, a lot of birds actually do stop because they're like us, they need to eat every day to be active. And what they eat really depends on what type of bird it is. So, birds will stop and forage on berries or seeds or insects, fish. It all depends on the species. In migration, one of the more kind of spectacular examples of this is along the Delaware Bay with red knots. Right around this time every year, mid to late May, red knots are migrating north from parts of South America to the Arctic, and they're timing their migration so that they can be there at the peak spawn of horseshoe crabs, because they feed almost exclusively on horseshoe crab eggs. And I've had this experience of seeing these birds there, and it's just incredible, the thousands of birds that will pack these tiny beaches to eat these eggs. And that's because they need this fuel to make their journey north. And not every bird will eat horseshoe crab eggs, but every bird will try to find resources along their journey so that they can continue on to their breeding grounds.
Yes, and that's certainly one of the famous migratory stopover stories, as scientists call it. So we're almost out of time for our segment, but I'll just mention quickly that in all of our green spaces around us, whether that's a roof deck or a yard, we can also do our part by planting plants that provide food for birds, because so many birds on migration use berries, insects that use native plants. So we'll drop a link in the chat that lets you look at about the plants that will support birds near you. This is really great and informative. Thank you so much to both of you, Chad and Nico. And for our viewers, make sure to check the comment section to get some links to learn more. Thank you both.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. Yeah.
So for our next segment, I know our viewers at home are going to be super excited. I know I'm excited for this. So it's a pleasure to invite two of our colleagues from Audubon Center for Birds of Prey in Florida to the show. Laura Von Mutius is the center's education manager, and Katie Gill Warner is the center director. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hey, so we all know that spring also means baby birds. So I think you have some screech owl footage that we're going to check out, right?
Yes, yes.
Screech owl trail cam.
So what we're looking at here is the first part, we have some adult screech owls, and they're in one of our aviaries. And You'll see some of their behaviors. Again, remember, owls are most active in the evenings. And so we're taking a look at some adults that are having their meal for dinner. You can see he's chomping it down and excited to have that little mouse. And then as we go through the footage, there's also going to be some of our younger baby owls that are under our rehabilitation program and in a different area.
Really cool. And I guess the nighttime activity means we're looking at an infrared picture or something like that with the black and white image. So Katie, how do the screech owls end up at the Audubon Center for Birds of Prey? What got them here?
So screech owls and other birds of prey that are injured arrive at our center from a variety of ways. We have individuals that find them. Maybe they fell out of their nest or their nest came down and maybe they found them on the side of the road and they'll bring them to our facility. They also come from other rehabilitators that might not specialize in birds of prey. Animal control helps us out. And then we also have a small group of volunteers that help with any rescues.
Cool. So I just saw that bowl of mealworms and they were eating mice before. What else do screech owls eat?
So remember, all of our birds of prey and raptors are meat eaters. So these guys like to eat mealworms, small rodents, some lizards, and one of their favorite delicacies is actually cockroaches. So they're great to have around your yard and they can take care of maybe some of the unwanted bugs that you might not want in your house.
It's good to know.
Eating crickets, so those two.
So I've also noticed that there aren't any humans in this video. Do you know why?
So we put in this camera, it's a trail cam, and as David noticed, we have it and it's able to have infrared so they can see in the evenings. What we like to do is be able to observe them without any human interruption. And so we can make sure, like these guys that you're seeing right now on the screen are some of our younger birds that are gonna potentially be released. We wanna make sure that they're eating okay and they're gaining strength and everybody is getting along in there and their behaviors, and we're preparing them for release back into the wild.
That's great. Well, certainly hoping for the best. So one of the things that we've seen here in the footage is owls dunking their food in the water. What's going on there?
So owls like us, they need to hydrate and they get much of their hydration through their food. So that one happened to have a mealworm and it was dunking it in for just some extra water.
Very cool.
So once these owls are rehabilitated, where do they go?
We always try to take any of our birds that are going out for release back to where they came from. That's the territory that they know. And so we usually have the information of if someone brought it to us, you know, the general area, be able to get them back where they belong and to a safe place where they came from. If it's dangerous, we will maybe move it to another area, but that's their area and their territory. So we make every effort to bring them back to where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. So you can put your questions for Katie in the chat. But Katie, because it's spring, I know we get a lot of this and you do too. People come across baby birds. They're outside of the nest and people want to know, do they need help? What should I do? Should I leave it alone? Should I pick it up? So what would you say to people who are looking for help with baby birds?
Sure. So we get calls about that all the time. And in springtime, everybody's nesting. You know, you can go through the different species in the different areas of the country. And so what we really want to help people do is identify, does this bird need help? We have younger nestlings that may be the smaller birds that still have all of their fuzzy down feathers. They're extremely dependent on their parents. And so the best thing that any baby bird could do is be raised by their parents. Something that people may not know is that it's an old wives' tale that if you find a young baby bird, you can't touch it or put it back in the nest because their parents will reject it. Well, actually, birds don't have a good sense of smell and they don't rely on that sense like mammals do. So if it's safe enough and you're able to, the best thing to do is plop it back in the nest. Some of the older birds, like the fledglings, are found often jumping out of the nest. They're learning how to fly. Maybe they're on the ground, but usually the parents are close by, keeping an eye on them, still making sure they're safe, looking out for predators, and ensuring they have enough food. So it's best to, you know, give your local rehabilitator a call if you truly think it's injured. Maybe it has a broken leg, or you can see that a wing is drooping or something like that. And they can walk you through the process of safely getting it to someone who can get it help.
That's really helpful. And we've got a diagram on the screen. We'll also drop a link to this graphic in the chat. But Katie, could you describe a little more the difference between the term nestling and fledgling and what that implies for what people should do?
Sure. If you see a bird that looks very fuzzy and downy, and of course they all look adorable, this is going to be your nestling, meaning that it's very young, it's still remaining in the nest with its parents, being fed frequently by its parents, and they're most vulnerable to being imprinted, maybe if someone found it or on other objects. Imprinting is when they first start associating with their parents through calls and feeding, and that's who they know are their parents. As they get a little bit older, they get more of their adult type feathers. Birds grow quite quickly, so they don't rely on their parents as much. The parents will stay away from the nest from a little bit longer periods of time and just bring back food at certain times of the day. So really it's going to be able to tell when you look at their feathers to see what colors they are, and if they look similar to the adults or more like an actual baby.
Well, thanks for that. So we're going to have another special guest coming up in just a minute, but before we get to that, Katie, we have another viewer question. Lara wants to know, do birds of prey imprint?
Yes, it's something that we work very hard at the center when we get young birds through our facility. You know, in baby season, we can see almost 200 babies come through our site from March through June. So we use a lot of equipment and preventative measures to prevent imprinting. Imprinting is when a bird wouldn't know how to survive in the wild on its own, that it's relying on maybe humans feeding it or other types of external factors that it doesn't realize how to have its nature instincts. So we use camouflage, we use puppets, we use sound calls, and don't let them have any viewing of human interactions. We really try to keep it, if there's a foster parent available, we do that as well so they can be with their own type of parent.
Thank you, Katie. So David mentioned that we're going to have a very special guest in just a second. I hear that we're going to have a chance to meet one of the babies from this year, the great horned owl.
Yes, I'm going to introduce Laura Bermudez with one of our special friends.
Hello, everyone. Like Katie said, my name is Laura, and this is my friend Cora, and she is a fledgling great horned owl. And Cora was brought to our center as a pre-fledged back the middle of March. And so she's probably about 10 weeks or so old right now. And you can see she still has her fluffy baby feathers. She was injured, so she is one of those birds that was brought to our clinic to be rehabilitated. And unfortunately, she is non-releasable, so she will not be going back to the wild. And you can actually see what her injury is there, her eye. So when she was brought in, that eye was injured, and our clinic staff did what they could for that eye, but eventually it was determined that she's totally blind in that eye. And not just that is the problem, but because that eye and the injury is actually changing her facial disc that she would be using for hunting in the wild. So because of that, she cannot go back to the wild. Unfortunately, she would not survive.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really nice to meet you both. So baby season sounds like a really busy time at the Center for Birds of Prey, but do you know if there's any birds that live with you all year round?
Yes. So our goal is to always put the injured birds, get them healthy, put them back into the wild. However, like Cora, sometimes their injuries prevent that from happening. So we have about 50 permanent residents that live here of 19 different species, and they will live here at our center for the rest of their days, and we will give them a good home. They cannot be returned to the wild.
Mm-hmm. And I was curious if you knew the difference between non-releasable birds and birds that you are working with to rehabilitate.
Yes, of course. So our birds that are in our clinic are patients, and they don't get names like Cora does, their nickname. They just get a patient number, and our job again is to get them healthy, go totally through the rehabilitation process, and release them back to the wild. And then if they're deemed non-releasable because of their injuries, that's when they can stay with permitted places like us as a permanent basis. And if we don't have room for the bird here, then we will find it a home at a different facility that is permitted to take care of that bird for the rest of its days.
Well, Cora is really beautiful. It looks very curious, Laura. Andy wants to know whether she can fly, whether Cora can fly.
Right on schedule.
Well, there's a demonstration right there.
So yes, Cora has actually, again, she's, you know, at that age, they do fledge or learn to fly about 9 or 10 weeks old, which is pretty close to what we estimate her to be. So she can fly. She has figured out how to get up to high perches and low perches during her daytime habitat where we keep her. So she can still fly. And then, of course, that is a learned thing, or it's instinctual, but it does take some time for her to figure that out. So when they are young, pre-fledge and nestlings, they're not flying, and they actually don't have their adult feathers until they are older, like Cora. So you can see her flight feathers are all in. So all her wings and her tail are what have grown in. And then we know that she's still young, though, because you can see she's missing her telltale great horned owl horns, which of course are not actually horns. But you can see those ear tufts haven't quite grown in yet. That's one of the last feathers that the great horned owls will grow when they get their feathers in.
Yeah, it's the telltale with 2 ears that you mentioned that people always are like, yeah, that's a great horned owl. So could you tell us a little bit about, oh yes, David's showing us his great horned owl. So do you know any facts, like other fun facts about great horned owls?
Yes. They are an amazing species. So some cool things that they have that are special is their strength. So their grip strength in their talons. Ooh, let's see if you can see some talons. 1, check out those nails.
Wow.
2, their grip strength. They can squeeze their talons over 500 pounds of pressure per square inch. So it makes them super strong. They're one of the few birds of prey that we have here in Florida that can carry off more than they themselves weigh. So she is full grown size-wise. She won't get any larger as far as size. We're talking about 3 pounds or so is what she weighs. And she can carry off more than that, which is pretty awesome. And they are also the most widely spread of the owls that we have here in North America. So no matter where you're watching from tonight, here in North America at least, Canada to Alaska, all the way through the States and down into Mexico and Central America, you have this type of owl, which is pretty cool. Now, you might, I don't know if you can hear, but she is making some small little baby noises. They don't get their classic owl hoot until about a year old. So she's got many more months to go. So she does making sort of her baby call at the moment, which would be sort of talking to siblings, talking to parents and other adults in the area. When she's hungry, those calls get very incessant because she's calling for parents to feed me.
Wow, really neat. We have a viewer question, Laura, from Carol, who wants to know whether male great horned owls or female great horned owls are larger.
Great question, Carol. So for raptors in general, across the board, in most cases, that is, the females are larger by about 25%. So again, she weighs about 3 pounds. The other thing that determines sort of size is where they are in the country. So here in Florida, our owls are smaller than what you're going to have up in Alaska and farther into Canada. So up there, you guys can have great horned owl females that are up to 5 pounds, which is obviously going to be quite a bit bigger than her 3.
That's a cool fact. So here's another question. How many babies do these owls typically have?
Great question. So they're going to lay about 2 to 4 eggs, and of those, not all of them survive. So they're really probably only raising 1 or 2 babies out of the eggs that they actually lay. And that's good. That obviously saves some resources for the parents to only feed a couple mouths as opposed to big, large broods of multiple babies. Makes it a little bit easier that way to take care of all of the babies that they have.
Yeah, for sure. And where do they typically nest?
Good question. They are a very odd bird that they do not build their own nests. They will actually just take it over or steal it from something else, larger birds, like a red-tailed hawk, for example, bald eagles. These guys are stronger than bald eagles and obviously have better vision at nighttime, so it's not unheard of that they will just steal a bald eagle's nest from the bald eagles. And then other large birds like crows, for example. And those are going to be usually in trees, but they're not really picky since they're not building it their own. If they find a nest on a cliff, for example, they would use that as well. And they do tend to be found in more woody areas and different types of woods. They're not even all that set to old growth or new growth. Different wooded areas, but it's also not unheard of to have them in suburban or even city areas. So depending on where you live, again, you probably have these guys not too far from you.
Yes, it's really neat to hear them hooting through the woods, even in the suburbs. So Laura, we're seeing a couple of themes in the comments. One, when you mentioned that birds are larger in the north, people wondering why, and I believe that's an adaptation to the colder temperatures. But people are also asking, what do you think caused the eye injury on this bird?
We don't really know. I don't know if you can
Look
hear
at
her
those
talk.
wings.
So we don't really know what caused the injury. It could have been something happened in the nest, maybe between siblings or a parent. It could have been falling out of the nest is what actually caused the eye injury. So we don't really, unfortunately, know. I don't speak owl and she doesn't speak English. So a lot of our patients that we get into the clinic, we can make our best guesses why things happen, but we don't always really know the answer.
Yeah, sometimes an educated guess is the best way to go. So someone wants to know, does anything prey on owls?
So when they're small, yes, of course, they could be preyed upon about other birds of prey, for example, or if they're small, left unintended, things like raccoon, for example. But these guys are pretty far up that food chain. Not much is going to mess with a great horned owl, again, because of their strength. And so actually, they are one of the biggest predators of the barred owls, and barred owls like to eat screech owls. So owls just eat everything and eat each other. But as a full-grown great horned owl, not much is going to be preying on them.
Yeah, an apex predator for sure. Another question we have, Laura, is Nancy wants to know whether all owls are nocturnal or only some.
Good question. And only some, although the majority is. So these guys are purely nocturnal. They are awake and active during nighttime. There's some other owls like our barred owl that we have here in Florida that is crepuscular. So they're active sort of dusk and dawn and not during the middle of the night or middle of the day. And then we also here in Florida, and if you live in the Southwest, have the burrowing owl. And they are not nocturnal at all. They break all the rules. They're naturally diurnal and are awake during the day.
Yeah, I saw them in Arizona, I think a year or two ago, and it was the most amazing experience. It was so adorable. So we have a question from Desiree who asks, what is the lifespan of great horned owls?
Great question. So in the wild, we're looking at about 20, maybe 25 years for the larger species of owls like a great horned. The smaller owls like a screech owl are going to be less than that, closer to 10 years. So size does kind of make a difference there. But under human care, they can live a lot longer. So we can sometimes get them into their 30s as a great horned owl under human care, even lower range of 40s. So they just get good care, good medical care, good food, and no predators. And of course, we can take care of any injuries they have. Ooh, can you all see what she's doing? You might have noticed her beak was open and it looked like her chin was moving. It is a little warm in the house. We turned off the air to not mess with the sound. And because of that, this is her thermoregulating, panting like a dog to cool herself off.
Oh, that's really cool to witness.
Yeah, really amazing.
Well, thank you so much. This was truly a treat for all of us. So thank you to you, Laura and Cora, and thank you, Katie, for joining us earlier.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for all you do. Well, as always, we want to end the show tonight by asking you to take an action to help birds. And this week, we need your help to stop a bad plan that will destroy 200,000 acres of migratory bird habitat in the Mississippi Flyway. These are forests and wetlands that support hundreds of bird species migrating all across the Americas. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has announced an unprecedented move to bring back a wasteful and environmentally devastating project called the Yazoo Backwater Pumps Project. And that's along the lower Mississippi River in the state of Mississippi. I used to live and work right in that area, so I know how special these habitats are. So the thing about this project is that it's expensive, it's antiquated, and it was actually vetoed by the George W. Bush presidential administration. But it's back like a zombie project. In theory, the plan is supposed to protect communities from flooding, but the Army Corps' own analysis has found that even under the best case scenario, 2/3 of the supposedly protected areas would still suffer from flooding. So that means after spending hundreds of millions of dollars and destroying 200,000 acres of habitat, the project will still fail to protect most communities from flooding. So we're asking you to write to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and tell them that you oppose this wasteful project. We've drafted a letter for you, so you can see it here on the screen. This has some information and comments from experts. You can send it through this online form, and you can also add your own comments about why this is important to you wherever you live. So many of you across the country have birds that come through the Mississippi Flyway. So we'll drop a link to this letter in the comments. You can click on it there. You can also go to audubon.org/Yazoo. That's audubon.org/YAZOO. Fill out the form, send in your letter, and help protect that 200,000 acres of habitat and all the birds that depend on it. So with that, I think, Christine, we have a time for a couple more burning viewer questions.
Yeah, thank you, David. So over the last few weeks, we've gotten some questions come in around the theme of sharing space with birds. We've seen this question come in more than once, and that's why I thought it'd be a good idea to ask our, you, David, Bringer, co-host, some questions about how to share the space so we can all learn a bit about the do's and don'ts of being good neighbors to our fellow visiting and resident birds. So the first question is it safe to put out lint from my dryer out for nesting material?
So you do not want to put out dryer lint for nesting material for birds. To people, it feels soft. I can understand why a lot of people think that might be a good idea. But that material is actually going to mat down and get sticky when it gets wet. It also has a lot of artificial fibers, microplastics, dyes. So that is not a good idea to be introducing to birds or the environment. You can, though, use pet hair when you brush out your cats or dogs. You can put out human hair. If you're doing a quarantine self-haircut like I did this weekend, you can throw that out. The birds will love that for their nest. And those natural materials are things that they would find in the wild, and they're perfectly safe.
Yeah, and we also have an article that talks more about the difference between what you can and cannot put as nesting material. So that would be a helpful thing to consult as well. So here's another question. If someone has a robin's nest on top of their garage door opener or on an active window ledge, for instance, is it safe to move that nest or will a bird abandon it?
Yeah, you never want to try to move a bird's nest. People sometimes think that birds will smell you, and as was mentioned earlier on the show, it's not the smell, it's the disruption and the danger that the moving causes. And it's actually illegal to move a bird's nest in the United States. So the best thing that you can do is try to make sure that wherever the nest is, it's protected. If you need to go out a different door in your house, most of the smaller songbirds that nest around people's houses, those babies are going to grow up and leave the nest in between 10 and 14 days. So it might be a minor inconvenience for a few days, but the joy of watching those birds grow up right next to your home is going to be well worth any inconvenience. So definitely don't try to move the nest once they're built.
Yeah, it's really important to know. So I think we have time for one more question. How often should someone clean their bird bath if they have one?
Good question. You know, when it starts to look dirty, if there's algae growing in it, if there's a lot of feathers and dirt that the birds have washed off themselves during their baths, if it looks dirty to you, it's probably time to clean it for the birds. Of course, they drink in a lot of mud puddles and other kinds of things that we're not able to do as humans safely. But what can happen in bird baths is there can be different kinds of microorganisms or other things that grow. They're not good for the birds. So, you know, depending on where you are, how much sunlight the bird bath gets, how hot it is, you might need to change it, wash it out once a day. Other places, if it's in the shade, a little cooler, maybe you can go a few days. But just keep an eye on it, keep it full of water, and when it starts to look a little grungy, wash it on out. The birds will thank you. So thanks for those, Christine. With that, we're going to say goodbye. We hope you see some great birds in the next few days. Looks like this weekend might be a great push of migrants through the rest of the country with some strong south winds. So we look forward to seeing you on next week's show. Have a great night, everybody.